The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
All right, hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. We are continuing our three-part series on improving safety for bicyclists today. So the Designing for Bicyclist Safety webinar series is based on a new training course that was developed by the Federal Highway Administration, VHB, and Tool Design Group. And the course is really intended to cover the fundamentals of designing streets and intersections to prioritize safety for bicyclists. Last Tuesday, if you were here, we set the stage for the series with a discussion about how we can better prioritize roadway improvements for bicyclists and incorporate the needs of cyclists into our decision making. The rest of the series today and next Thursday's episode will focus on the designs that we can really use to enhance bicyclist safety and comfort. So today we'll be focusing on designs along the roadway, bicycle facilities themselves along the road, and then next week we'll really be getting into more information about crossings and intersections and specific things you can do at those locations. The webinar series is supported by the Federal Highway Administration's Office of Safety through a program that provides training and technical assistance to the FHWA designated pedestrian and bicyclist safety focused cities and states. My name is Dan Jeline. I'll be facilitating the webinar today, and I would like to take a moment to introduce you to each of our panelists joining us today. First, we're going to be hearing from Brooke. Brooke is a safety and geometric design engineer with the Federal Highway Administration's Resource Center. Brooke led the development of the Designing for Bicyclist Safety training course with assistance from VHB, Tool Design Group, and others, and she's been leading the training in cities around the country. We're also joined by Mike Seinecke. He's a project manager for Lee Engineering. Mike specializes in pedestrian and bicycle safety. He spent 26 years with the Phoenix, Arizona Transportation Department and has a wealth of experience in developing and implementing safety countermeasures. Finally, we're joined by Pete Lagerway, who is a senior planner with Tool Design Group. Peter's more than 30 years managing pedestrian and bicycle projects and programs, many of those with the city of Seattle. And Brooke, Mike, and Peter together have led dozens of training courses on pedestrian and bicycle safety around the country to assist agencies in improving safety for non-motorized road users. We're really lucky to have them here today and have them guide us through some of this material. Before we get into the presentations today, I'll just shift gears for a moment so I can cover a few housekeeping items. Attendees, I'd like to ask if you can hear me. If you can please raise your hand by clicking the hand icon in the corner of your screen there. I can take a look and make sure that everybody can hear us and that we're coming through loud and clear. Okay, great. See those hands going up. I appreciate that. Thanks for joining us today. If for any reason during the webinar your computer freezes up, I'd encourage you to please just reload the website and log back in. You should be able to just rejoin the session that way. You can note that as an attendee, you won't be able to speak during the webinar, but you will have the ability to submit questions and comments to us using the chat function. We'll be monitoring that area, and you can submit your questions and comments at any time. I'll try to intersperse a few questions throughout as we move through the material, but we will be trying to hold about 20-25 minutes or so at the end of the presentation for a bigger discussion period. We'll be posting, we already have posted the presentation slides to our website. We're going to be recording the webinar and posting the recording to the website as well. So you will be able to refer back to anything that you missed. The presentation slides are available now. If you were to visit pedbikeinfo.org/webinars and follow the link to this series, you'll be able to find those slides posted. The video will probably take another day to get up online, but it should be up within 1 or 2 days. Later today, you're going to be receiving a follow-up email from the UNC Highway Safety Research Center. That's going to include a link that will allow you to generate a certificate of attendance for this webinar. Excuse me. So it's just important that if you are attending with a few other people at your site, make sure to pass that link along to them so they can also get their certificate of attendance as well. The email is going to contain a link to the website where we've already posted the slides from today, and we'll be archiving the material. An important note, if you're attending, maybe you can't attend all the webinars in this series, we're going to be archiving the webinars all on the same page, so you use the same link. So every time we host one of these webinars, we're going to be adding the next video and the next slide set to that page, so they won't be all in different places. You just go to that one site to get all the information. The webinar has been submitted to the American Planning Association to be considered for 1.5 CM credits. I'd encourage you to check the AICP event calendar for more information about that. You can learn a lot more about all the PBIC webinars we have coming up by visiting pedbikeinfo.org/webinars. You can follow us on Facebook and Twitter. PedBikeInfo is our handle, and you can sign up for our newsletter. These are all good ways to keep up with all the sessions we're going to be covering. We have a few coming up over the next few months that are particularly relevant for bicycle safety and bicycling in general. So if you are into that topic, please check out some of our other webinars. I just want to, before we move on, I want to ask if you all can help me and respond to a poll question. I'd like to find out how many people are out there today attending from your site. So if you could just let us know very quickly if it's just you at your site, if you've got a few people joining you, maybe a group of 2 or 3, 4 or 5, 6 or 7 or more than that. That'll just help us better understand how many people are out there today. I don't want to spend too much time on this. I'll maybe keep it open for 10 more seconds, and then we'll get right into our presentations. We have quite a bit of material to cover today, so I want to make sure we don't waste too much time before we get into it. So maybe take a few more seconds to vote on our poll. We do appreciate that feedback. We'll move right over into our presentations. Okay, great. I'm going to go ahead and close the poll now. Thank you all very much for doing that. Brooke, you should see the screen come your way, and whenever you're ready, go ahead and go into your presentation, please.
All right, you should be seeing my screen now.
I do. Thank you.
Okay, well, let's get started. First off, I'd just like to thank my fellow panelists who are joining me today, Mike Seinecke and Peter Lagerwey. They've both been very helpful in developing these materials, but also in providing some good discussion in these webinars. If you'd like to say hello, Mike and Peter.
Hi. Hello.
Just another reminder, we've said this before in the previous webinar, things are changing quickly in what we know and what's recommended in terms of designing the features of bicycle facilities. And so just be cautious. Just because you've seen it in a picture in the guidelines or even seen it in a picture here today does not mean it is showing the perfect design or the latest and greatest in everything. It's an evolving practice, and so please double check the latest thinking or the latest MUTCD guidance before you implement a design. In the last webinar, we also talked about the reasons why you might choose to be doing something different or something more for bicyclists in your network. And so I'll refer you to that webinar for a further discussion on that. And another reminder of something we talked about in the previous webinar are some of these key safety factors. And as we move through the discussion today, many of the reasons we might do various treatments on a bikeway facility is to address the risk in terms of safety or comfort to bicyclists. And where we see greater risks, we might use more of our resources or address it more fully with the whole toolkit of things we have available to us. In places where I have identified the risks as being lower, then we may not do as much in terms of the features that we include in our plan or design. And bikeway networks, just like roads, are going to include a whole range of different facilities. But if we want to reach the broadest audience of potential bicyclists, we're going to be thinking about providing a comfortable network. And not every roadway in our network is going to be suitable for that comfortable bikeway network, but we want to make sure that we've connected those origin and destinations across a community. We'll be talking about a range of different types of bikeways today, and there's sort of a hierarchy. You know, the baseline would be a shared roadway where there may not be any specific bikeway features. And then if we have shoulders available to us, that is an opportunity to provide space for bicyclists. And then specific space that is set aside for bicyclists would be bike lanes. And then we can further enhance that by making it a separated bike lane. And then on top of the hierarchy in terms of maybe investment or right-of-way available would be a shared use path. And we'll talk briefly about each of those types of facilities today. First off, let's talk about shared roadways. Now this photo, while it doesn't show any particular bikeway features, this is a shared roadway. This is a facility that can and will be used by bicyclists. In a rural location, it might be perfectly acceptable when you have lower speeds, or if you have lower volumes or good sight distances, so that you can see the bicyclist make passing maneuvers as needed. If you're coming into a community where there might be some more origins and destinations, that might be where you'd want to rethink your approach and maybe think about having some additional features in that perimeter where you're more likely to get the less comfortable, shorter trip type riders. Shared roadway is going to be the most common type of facility potentially in a bikeway network. It's the roads as they are. It's going to be most appropriate on that low volume or low speed. And in a well-connected grid type network, it's going to be 85% of your roadway network is a shared roadway for bicyclists. Did I hear someone making a comment?
Sure. This is Pete. I would just add and support what you just said, is that no matter how many bike facilities you build in your community, you're just not going to have a facility that goes to every place of business and every place of residence. And so I just would support the notion here that 85%, give or take, of all the roadways that make up the network are not going to have a separate bike facility. And what it really does is it speaks to the fact that we need to really be thinking about complete streets and really making all of our streets, work for all modes. So I just think it's a good point.
Absolutely. And if you've got a quiet, low-speed residential street, it would almost be ludicrous to put a painted bike lane on that street. It would be overkill in a sense, and something else that you have to maintain as part of your network. Where you want to put your resources are on the busier streets where you need to create some dedicated space to make your bikeway network more comfortable. So shared lanes are every roadway unless it's specifically prohibited. And if you have a minor road, if your volumes are less than 1,000 vehicles per day, you really don't need any special features. In an urban area, certainly lower speeds are going to be preferable. In a rural area, it may be appropriate with the higher speeds, depending on traffic volume and bicyclist volumes. You can add supplemental features to further enhance the shared roadway concept. Now, I would not recommend the photo as the ideal design. It just shows some features that have been used, but certainly sharrows can be added as pavement markings. But if you're going to use something like a sharrow, you need to think about what's happening, especially at signals. If you're allowing bicyclists to take the lane at the intersection, will the intersection operate for them? Do you need detectors, and do you need to adjust signal timing? So it's not as simple as simply adding paint to the roadway.
Additionally, if I just might add that sharrows are really only recommended for lower speed streets of 35 miles or less. And I think the example you had up was a 40-mile-an-hour street.
Absolutely. And we'll talk more about that in a moment, but you make an excellent point. And in that particular photo, I think they did it out of lack of anything better they could do because it's on the approach to a railroad crossing and they didn't have space. But it would have been nicer if they could have brought the speeds down in combination with that. So some of the recommendations for shared lane markings, lateral position, it's really best to have them take the center of the lane, not have them close to the motor vehicles that are parked, because then you're putting bicyclists at risk of dooring type crashes. You might use shared lane markings to connect gaps in your network, preferably on those lower speed streets. You might use it on roadways where it's too narrow for passing, just to further emphasize that bicyclists are welcome and allowed on the street. But you also want to think about what is that doing to your operations of that roadway, and if maybe you need to prioritize creating some additional space so that you're not gumming up traffic along the corridor because the bicyclists are traveling at a much slower speed. And then certainly using sharrows might be useful at a more complicated intersection where you want to identify which lanes the bicyclist should be using to transition through the intersection, or at transitions where you have a bikeway ending and you want to emphasize where bicyclists are meant to go. So identifying those transitions. Here's an example photo of what you might do at an intersection where you have a number of auxiliary turning lanes to identify where the bicyclist should be for the through movement as well as the right turn movement. And as Mike was mentioning, there's a speed recommendation most definitely for when you use shared lane markings. If you use it at higher speeds, it's really not providing that comfortable network, and you're going to get some more irritation from the motorists as well. But the supporting characteristics are if you have multiple lanes so you can have passing, or if you're on a downhill section where the bicyclist can travel at a fairly rapid speed, or in locations where you have that short transitional segment that you need to get from one bikeway to another. Lower speeds, and where you have high bicycle use, so people are anticipating and expecting bicyclists on the roadway. If you have a single lane or an uphill situation where a lot of passing might be necessary, that might be a place where you'd prefer to do a separated space for a bike lane. If there's a parallel route that would be better, then maybe you don't want to do sharrows on the route you're looking at. Or if it's a very long segment, higher speeds, or if you have very few bicyclists using that corridor. And you know, as engineers, sometimes we like to make things very symmetrical. Well, if you have uphills and downhills, maybe you provide the bike lane on the uphill and the sharrows on the downhill, and then you can transition as needed. So think about what's appropriate in terms of grade. Do you have any other thoughts on that, Mike or Pete?
Yeah, I would just add, I think using a shared lane marking is a really nice tool to get over a barrier regarding bike lanes. Again, and you mentioned this, is that when you have a long corridor, there's likely to be a bridge or a spot or two where you just don't have the room, and this allows you to have a continuous facility. And I think it also, and I've used it this way, is if you have a couple spots where you're using shared lane markings, in a way it starts to identify future projects. So if there's a few pieces you want to fix along the way, again, quite often bridges, then it's a way of starting to make a list of things we may want to work on as well. So it can have a lot of different uses.
So in terms of the appropriate signing for bikeways, Mike, would you like to comment on the NCUTCD's perspective on share the road signs?
Well, yeah, there is a share the road sign that's in the manual that's available to use, but amongst the Bicycle Technical Committee and a number of bicycle advocates, it's somewhat in disfavor and more towards the on-roadway sign or the may use full lane signs. Basically, while bicyclists have a good understanding of what share the roadway means, there has been some incidences where drivers aren't as understanding and has a different concept of what share means. And so that the more of the use is going towards the other types of signs to let people know that bikes belong and are allowed to be on the roadways.
So we have the options here of a warning sign, warning that bikes are on the road, or a regulatory sign that says bikes may use the full lane of the roadway. They're not forced to creep towards the edge or use the shoulder.
Yeah, and while the share the road sign is still a viable option right now, the tendency is to go away from that sign to one of these two signs that are shown on the slide.
Another sign that we frequently see are these types of signs where we're talking about areas where you have a local ordinance that has a required passing distance between bicyclists. And this can be a little bit tricky because, first of all, traffic control devices aren't meant to be educational, and this is very much used in an educational aspect. And so instead, we recommend that bikes may use full lane and change lanes to pass. The other aspect of those signs is that those ordinances can be very difficult to enforce unless the bicyclist is actually hit. Then you have proof that the car was within 3 or 4 feet of the bicyclist, but unless the officer has some sort of visual eye to measure that distance, then it's hard to enforce that 3-foot distance. So it's good to use the change lanes to pass placard. Just change lanes and don't mess with this measurement of distance. And this is something that certainly can be used, but suggest using it in a place where there's an identified problem. So just to give a flavor of what some of the shared lane roadways may look like, this is one where we have a lower speed and it's level of traffic stress 1, a residential neighborhood type facility. On an arterial, certainly the level of traffic stress is going to be much higher. And then here's an example of a rural back road where the roadway is the bikeway. And with that, we'll move on to a discussion of paved shoulders.
Brooke, if I can jump in just quickly on shared lanes. There was a reference earlier to a volume threshold for, I guess, shared lanes, where above certain thresholds you'd want to add another feature like a sharrow or add more features to the road. And I think it was referencing low volume may not need something if it's like under 1,000 vehicles per day, I think is what you put on the slide. There were some questions about if that came from a certain set of criteria or guidelines, or is that just sort of a back of the envelope ballpark rule of thumb that that you all put in?
I don't recall where I pulled that from, but I want to say that's more a back of the envelope. But Mike or Pete, do you have any thoughts on that? I don't think AASHTO speaks to that at all.
I think you're absolutely right. It's just been what I would call common practice in developing networks. The other thing I would add too is there's been more interest in this lately, and we're not covering it a lot right now, but as communities develop bicycle boulevards or neighborhood greenways, that's one of the things they're looking at as well to help identify some of those streets.
So there's
just wanted to clarify that.
Yeah, so there's not a good hard and fast answer in a lot of these things yet. In fact, as we start seeing some of the dimensions and things, you know, as we mentioned in the webinar 1, we don't have all the analysis tools yet available to us, but some of the analysis tools that you can use to help you decide if you've got the design right is the level of traffic stress and the bicycle level of service. Those are both tools that will help you get there, but there again, they're evolving as analysis tools. And so a lot of this is using some judgment and then watching what's happening on your bikeway once it's installed to see if you got it right or if maybe you need to enhance it a bit further. So paved shoulders. This is something that's going to be useful for locations where you have higher traffic volumes and speeds. And it's a frequent application for rural locations, especially if you have an uphill direction where bicyclists are using the corridor. But remember, this is not a travel lane. You're going to have issues at intersection conflicts. And it's a good opportunity to think about maybe you don't have a bike lane between intersections, but when you get to that rural intersection, maybe you identify where the bicyclist should be through the intersection, get them through the intersection, and then continue on after. Pete mentioned last time that paint is your friend, and this might be a good application of having something different at the intersection, but going back to shoulders beyond. You also have to be thoughtful about design of rumble strips. It's a proven safety countermeasure for motorists, but we want to be thoughtful about how they're placed and designed so that they don't become a hazard for bicyclists. And then finally, maintenance. A lot of shoulders don't get swept or the snow doesn't get removed, and just a bit of gravel on the roadside can be a problem for bicyclists. So in terms of a shoulder bikeway, the AASHTO guidelines is 4-foot minimum width, 6 foot is desirable, and you don't need any particular special pavement markings between intersections, but I would caution you to think about what the intersections are doing. And so here's an example from a rural location of what that might look like. As I mentioned, the rumble strips are important for safety of motorists, but they are completely unrideable for bicyclists. And so we have certainly a recommended design providing gaps in that rumble strip so that a bicyclist can maneuver in and out of the shoulder as needed, and then providing at least 4 feet, but perhaps more, that is clear pavement surface without rumble strip. In this photo, this is a decent example, but they could have even further enhanced it by putting the rumble strip right directly under the stripe. And having it under the stripe makes it even more visible for motorists in wet pavement conditions because you have striping on a vertical edge of that rumble. And that's all we're going to say about shoulders for the time being. We're going to move on to a discussion of bike lanes.
Brooke, if I can jump in, sorry, a couple of questions came. We can clarify now. The couple questions. Sorry, on the maintenance side of things, Pete mentioned last time the big issue of a lot of crashes, single bicycle crashes, being caused by debris, things in the road, especially with respect to shoulders. In a typical circumstance, whose responsibility is the maintenance of the full shoulder? Is that just the agency that owns the roadway? Is that typically maybe a reason you hear against putting in shoulders, is the added maintenance cost?
I'll start with that. I've never heard of 2 different agencies maintaining a road, one the travel lane and one the shoulder. I think they usually go together. Actually, I've heard more often the reason you put in a shoulder is to reduce maintenance cost, quite the opposite. Because when you provide a shoulder, you don't get that fraying on the edge that you would where the white line is on this picture if you didn't have a shoulder. So I think it's a real win for everyone because it's a safety improvement for all modes, and your roadway lasts a lot longer. So I just think it's one of those really good ones to look at. I would also add, in terms of debris, when you have a driveway or especially a side road, if they're not paved, that gravel can easily spill onto the shoulder area, and that's why typically, if there's any amount of volume at all, we'd recommend paving that apron to the driveway or paving it back a little bit from into the gravel roadway to prevent that spillover onto the shoulder.
Yeah, I would agree 100% with Pete. That's basically the shoulders reduce maintenance costs, and it's something that agencies should be monitoring the roadway shoulders. And if a bicyclist comes and sees something on the shoulder, they should also be trying to knock it off or alerting the local agency so they can be taking care of it. Because many times the people who use the roadways are our eyes and ears along the roads.
Okay. Another question came up, and I don't know if I've ever heard this before, but if you've got enough room for a wide shoulder, 5 or 6 foot, what's the benefit or drawback in keeping that as a shoulder or technically designated as a bike lane if you have the width for it? Is that sort of a...
If it's designated as a bike lane, then you can't use it for emergency pull-offs or other things that you might need that shoulder for. And so if it's in an area where bicycle volumes aren't significant, or it's the more fearless bicyclist who's taking those much longer trips, I think you want to allow for those other uses of your shoulder in that location where an emergency pull-off or some maintenance type things might happen, where for a short segment the bicyclist would take the lane and then move back onto the shoulder. If it's a facility where you're getting a lot of bicycle traffic and you want to discourage those types of uses of the shoulder, then that's when you decide to make it a specific bikeway.
This is Pete, and I totally agree. And just add to that, in very rural areas where you have a lot of farms, having that shoulder available as extra space for wide farm equipment can also be really beneficial. And so the frequency of use of that shoulder is so low, it really doesn't make sense in very rural areas to designate it as a bike lane. Obviously, when you get into more urban areas, it's a whole different story. And I've even seen where shoulders are just left as shoulders, but when you come into a small town where activity really picks up, it may make sense as a gateway into the village or town that it becomes a formal bike lane for a bit. So it's really context sensitive in terms of how you do it.
Okay. Wonderful. Thank you very much. There are some more questions, but hopefully we'll have time to get to those at the end. I don't want to hold us up.
Okay, we'll move on to bike lanes then. So a bike lane is a portion of the roadway that's specifically designated for the preferential use of people on bikes. Some of the advantages, it's going to be low stress on a low speed street. It's going to provide that access to major destinations, using it on those crosstown collectors and arterials. It guides bicyclist behavior and predictability, and if we can predict where the bicyclists are going to be, it's going to make them more visible to motorists. It also allows the bicyclists to travel at their own pace, certainly faster than traffic in congested conditions, but slower than traffic when traffic is traveling at a speed faster than a bicyclist can pedal. It will also reduce those pedestrian conflicts and also improve safety, because the bicyclist, as we mentioned before, on the sidewalk is much more at risk of those driveway conflicts. Some of the disadvantages of a bike lane is it's going to be a higher level of traffic stress on arterials. And if you recall, most adult bicyclists are more comfortable at level of traffic stress 2. When you start getting up at 3 and 4, you're starting to filter out the users who will be on your bikeway. Very often we squeeze them in and they may be too narrow, and then we wonder why no one's using this wonderful bike lane that we put out there for them. Sometimes we're placing bike lanes at the expense of parking, and that can be a very heated issue that has to be thoughtfully considered. So some of the guidelines from AASHTO in terms of width: a desirable bike lane width is going to be as wide as 7 feet. The minimum is going to be somewhere along the lines of 5 feet if you're between a travel lane and parking. If you're against the roadside, you need to have 4 feet at least that's outside of that gutter pan. If you have a gutter pan that's in your bikeway, you really have made, depending on the shape and configuration, you've made part of that bikeway unusable. And so don't include that in your bikeway width design. Keep in mind that that seam is difficult to ride on, and the steepness of the gutter slope can be difficult for a bicyclist. Now, going up from a separated bike, or going up from a bike lane, you can have a separate, let me say that again. One step up from a bike lane is a buffered bike lane, where we create some space either between the bicyclist and the motorist, or between the bicyclist and the parked cars, or maybe a combination of both. Peter and Mike, would you like to talk about some of the design options related to this?
This is Mike here, and one of the things that we've looked at is trying to put more of the buffer many times, if it's a lower speed facility where there's not a lot of trucks or buses, between the bicyclist and the vehicles, and especially if there's a high turnover for the vehicles, where there's going to be a lot of people getting in and out. The buffer sometimes is better placed between the bicyclist and the parked cars, as opposed to the bicyclist and the street, the moving traffic lanes.
What about the different pavement marking options we have for buffered bike lanes, or that we've seen?
Typically the proper, if you have more than 3 feet, it's really difficult to do much when you have less than 3 feet, is between a moving lane and a bicycle lane would be a chevron type marking. You don't want to have double solid white lines, because that's something where a motorist is not allowed to cross it to get in and out of a parking place. This, what's shown over here, is acceptable, although again the chevron marking would probably be more appropriate in between the moving traffic lane and the bicycle lane going in the same direction.
So just a few additional thoughts in terms of thinking about the design. You know, what's your shy distance for motorists and bicyclists to help you decide how much width you need on either side of the bike lane? Will that buffer space provide some room for bicycle passing? how close you are to the door zone of cars. One advantage of this buffered bike lane, it gives you that wider space without confusing motorists into thinking that this is just another travel lane. And then it's certainly going to be more comfortable for bicyclists. And this is a photo from the NACTO guidance that shows some of the variations, and you can see an example of how we've got a number of different pavement markings shown here, and they're not necessarily all the preferred option, but there's different ways of thinking about it and different ways of applying it. And it's always good to identify where the parking space is relative to the bike lane so that you don't end up with parkers in the buffer space. So here we've got a few photos that show examples of bike lanes and the varying degrees of stress that a bicyclist might experience on them. This one would be a level of traffic stress 1. And here we've got a fairly generous bike lane, but it's on a busier street. The stress level is going up. And a little bit narrower. And then finally, while this gentleman does not look like our typical image of a road warrior, he's definitely on a higher stress roadway. Some thoughts on pavement marking and signing. To be a bike lane, you really have to have the longitudinal pavement markings and the pavement messages, either the symbol with the arrow or the words bike lane with the arrow, at the beginning and the end and at some interval in between. And there's no guidelines that say what that interval has to be. That takes some judgment and thought about how often you want to maintain them, as well as how often you need to provide that message. And then a final thought about signs. It used to be signs were a required element, but with sign clutter and so forth, we've recognized that maybe they're not as critical an element, and we need to be thoughtful about those as well. So certainly, we can place a sign at the beginning and the end of it or an interval, but there again, it is an optional choice. And the sign that we're showing on the right is the approved sign today. We don't use diamonds anymore anywhere for bike lanes.
This is Mike, and I would like to say that the bike lane sign is desirable, but it is not required, and predominantly in the CBD areas where there's just so much competition for signs that you can't put every sign in every place, and this is one way you may want to not install if you have too many other signs to be installed in that area.
Pete, did you have a comment too?
I did. Could we go back one? And I want to make a comment about the intervals of putting in the bike lane symbol with the arrow there. And you're absolutely right. There isn't really definitive guidelines on this, but I think there's sort of a good best practice. And generally, you want to put them when on the far side of intersections where new motorists might be entering that roadway, so it alerts them to the fact that this indeed is a bike lane. So you don't need to do it every street necessarily, especially if they're very minor. But typically, if it's a street where people are, say, making right turns onto an arterial like the one you see here, doing a far side bike symbol like this is quite often appropriate. The other thing to note, too, is that if you do have a bus stop or a dashed area, like you can see this dash zone here, is typically you want to put the bike lane symbol just beyond where the dashed area ends. Sort of generally best practice.
Another thing to think about is the location of the driveways, and if you're going to have a situation where motorists turning in and out of the driveway are always going to be running over your pavement message, you might want to be aware of that and shift it accordingly so that your pavement message will last longer. Thank you for your comment.
So can we go back to the slide that shows the buffer on the buffered bike lane? I've got a couple of questions. Thought it'd be helpful to have it up. Okay, so, and actually either this or the next one would work. A couple of questions here. So first, you use the term shy distance. Some folks are not familiar with that term. Can you define that briefly so we know what you mean?
Well, if you've got something vertical very close to you, you're not going to ride up right against it. You know, think about walking along a sidewalk where there's a wall right next to you. You don't walk with your shoulder brushing against the wall. You step a little distance away from it. So anything like signs or parked cars or moving motor vehicles are going to tend to push you away from that physical vertical barrier in a sense.
Yep. Thanks for that. And then the other question on this slide in particular, a few questions about on the buffered bike lane. Some folks had asked about putting that buffer on the other side of the lane so that it actually buffers between parking and the bike lane rather than the buffer happening between the travel lane and the bike lane. So can you talk about benefits? I mean, ideally, in some cases, you may want both, but you know, if you're putting the buffer on the left side, you're maybe creating more space between the bikes and vehicular traffic. If you're putting it between the bikes and the cars, you're trying to keep that dooring crash from happening. I don't know if there's a preference or if it sort of is context specific.
I think it's really context specific. It's going to depend on how much parking turnover you have, how often people are getting in and out of the cars versus how much traffic or how many big trucks or buses you have in that traffic. You know, whether the biggest discomfort is coming from the roadway or from the roadside, and then trying to come up with the best choice between the two. In this case, I might have taken a little bit of the buffer from the roadway side and put it towards the roadside side, maybe split the difference a little bit as compared to this photo. In other situations, I might do something different. Mike or Pete? Oh,
go ahead.
I was just going to see if Mike or Pete had anything to add.
Yeah, I would just add a thought too. Again, this is getting back to specific situations. I would look at the speed differential between the moving motor vehicles and the bicycle. So for example, if you had a pretty steep downhill and the speed limit was 30, the speed differential between the bike and the motor vehicles would be less than on a flat or an uphill. And if you had parking, at the same time, you really don't want a dooring when you're going down a hill. And so in that situation, I might move the buffer, you know, on the parked car side. So a lot of things to take into consideration.
And the final question on this slide was is there guidance or a preference of for the diagonal hash marks in the buffer, the direction of those, the frequency of those? Where can people look for more guidance on how those should be drawn?
I think this is Mike Seinecke, and this is a discussion at a couple of the last bike technical committee meetings. And I believe if you have a wider area, that the chevron is the preferred marking for this, and as opposed to the hasher there. So it just basically is consistent with the bike lane going in the same direction as the motor vehicle lane. But when it gets very small, I think with 3 feet or less, I think that this hash marking is fine, or something just to take up the space in there. But when it gets less than 3 feet, it's hard to do the chevron.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great.
And I would just add here.
Yeah, go ahead, Pete.
Oh, okay. I would just add that this is the correct way to do it, which is shown on the picture here. Whereas it's slightly tilted, in the direction of where you want the motor vehicles to be. So the line should guide your eye, which ultimately guides your driving to where you want the motorists to be. So this is correct. You don't want it the opposite way.
Okay. And then, sorry, one more question on this. For your buffer there between the bicycle lane and the motor vehicle lane, what sort of widths are we talking about there? What ranges? It looks, maybe if I had to guess, 4 feet, 4 feet maybe?
I think 2 to 3 feet can make a difference there. But the guidance, like the NACTO guidance, has some recommended dimensions there. In fact, maybe if we go to the next slide, it may even show us if we can squint at that page.
Okay.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't. Does it show 30 inches maybe?
Interior diagonal cross hatching or chevron markings if in 3 feet or wider for the buffer. It says then probably if it's less than that, you're probably not going to have the chevrons or the hashing. So it seems like it is there's a lot of options depending on what the type of space you have, and what you're really doing is just adding that extra bit of distance, whether you can make it 3-4 feet or 2 feet, whatever you have. It's just adding that space in there, as opposed to, I'm guessing, as opposed to what you might do otherwise is just reallocate that space to the travel lane. You're tightening up your travel lane in favor of adding a buffer.
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say typically a door zone is about 3 feet when you look at how wide it is for a door and the person to get in and out. But if you don't have it, 2 foot's better than nothing.
Absolutely. And again, I would just point out on this slide, if you look at the left side of the slide with 2 double white lines, again, it gets back to what Brooke said in the very beginning. This guidance is evolving. And I think in the future, again, stay tuned, but you're going to see those inside lanes dashed so you don't have the double white.
Yeah. Okay.
Do you have any more questions for us, Dan?
Plenty more, but let's keep moving on. We've got quite a bit to cover in the last bit, so maybe we'll have some time at the very end to go back through some of these.
All right. Now, last week in the webinar, we had a question about when you might choose to have a CONTRA-FLOW bike lane and what you might do with that. Certainly, one of the reasons you might do this is you have some one-way streets in your network, but you're really making it a long out of direction for your bicyclist to get across town. You might choose to do a CONTRA-FLOW bike lane. You also might do it to avoid conflicts. For example, if you have a lot of driveways or parking on one side of the street, you can put the bikeway on the opposite side of the street to avoid those conflicts. It's a matter of avoiding the greatest risk and evaluating your situation to see what you think might be worse for the bicyclist. And then you might choose to do a two-way bikeway on one side of the street to maximize your space, or to provide for parking on one side of the street and bikeways on the other side of the street, so that you're at least not destroying all of the parking opportunities in a community. And that might give you a little extra space to provide some buffers, where you might be using very minimal buffers or no buffers at all if you have one bikeway on either side of the street. Some of the considerations certainly are pavement markings. You're going to want to mark your bikeways just like you would a two-way street with yellow stripes between the opposing lanes of travel. Signing is also going to be a concern. What sort of information are you providing to the side streets coming in? That it's not just a one-way street anymore, but you have two-way traffic flow. So you might be adding some supplemental plaques to your stop signs. And then certainly your intersections have now changed. Instead of being an intersection for a one-way street, you now have to account for the CONTRA-FLOW bicyclists who need to have signal heads as well.
This is Pete.
Yeah.
Oh, I just add to it too. This can really, it's very doable, but it can really complicate your signalization, because you might not have signal heads in a phase for obviously the motor vehicles going the other way. So you really need to build that in, and it also needs to be built in with the pedestrian signal, because even if where there's a CONTRA-FLOW bike lane, typically the pedestrians are going to be able to cross the street in all directions. And so this is a situation where you might even want to consider a leading bicycle interval. In other words, give bikes a little advantage of going straight, especially if there's a lot of left turning movement or even a dedicated phase. So again, not going to get into all those details here, but just to make folks aware of the fact that it's something that really has to be looked at.
Thank you, Peter. So now we're going to move into a conversation about separated bike lanes. And there have been a number of terms that have been used to describe these: cycle tracks, protected bike lanes. And this is the terminology that we've sort of advocated, for one, because it's more understood than a cycle track. That sounds like something that's going in a circle in one direction. And then protected bike lanes, we try to avoid things that can be a target for legal action. And certainly just because we've put a separated bike lane in does not mean that there's a magic force field between the bicyclist and the motorist. So our definition of a separated bike lane, it's an exclusive bike facility, just like a bike lane. It's adjacent to or on the roadway. It can be one-way or CONTRA-FLOW, and it has some vertical element. And that's what really defines it as distinct from a bike lane. Some of the advantages are that it's going to be very low stress mid-block. It encourages bike riding. It's much more conspicuous for motorists and bicyclists, and we are finding that it reduces crash rates. Some of the disadvantages are that it needs special treatments for those conflict points at intersections, driveways, parking, transit, and loading zones. But I would like to emphasize here that this isn't true just for separated bike lanes. It really, we need to be doing special treatments for any bike lane that we're putting out there, particularly at those higher risk locations. And I think sometimes that those conflict points have been ignored previously. There's an example of a bikeway in a community near where I am, where at every intersection they put the sign bike lane ends, and there's no treatments for bicyclists at the intersection. And then at the far side of the intersection, they say bikeway begins. And they've done this all along the corridor, which I think is the misapplication of the intent of those signs, but just shows that even bike lanes in the traditional sense need special treatments at intersections. So don't let that be a reason to deter you from considering a separated bike lane. They do require a little more space than just a bike lane, and they can be more costly depending on how many features you add to them. And because we don't have a lot of these facilities across the country, we're building more all the time, and so we have much more to learn. Because the AASHTO guidelines did not address separated bike lanes, and there has been a lot of desire for more information, FHWA developed this separated bike lane planning and design guide to address that emerging need for guidance. And it describes, what we know and how much background information we have on it, and we'll know more in time as our knowledge and experience increases. I'd also like to point to this design guide. It's the Massachusetts DOT's separated bike lane guide, which was developed, and it builds on and enhances the information that is in the FHWA guide. And so it's another good resource to look to in terms of thinking and guidance related to separated bikeways.
This is Pete. I'm just going to add a comment here too. If we just stay on that one for a second.
You bet.
Okay. This is just an example, Brooke, of what you were saying before, of where the thinking is advancing sometimes faster. We can turn it out. We would no longer make that entire green bike lane solid. We would have more of the continental stripes in green, but connecting the white dots on both sides, if you will, looking a little more like the pedestrian marked crosswalk there. So it's evolving, and also a lot of these concepts, I think we will be in the new AASHTO guide that's coming out next year. So again, I think it's just a word of caution that these things are changing very, very quickly.
Thank you, Pete. So some of the reasons you might consider having a separated bike lane, do you already have bicyclists using the corridor, or do you have a potential for bicyclists using the corridor if a more comfortable facility existed? Do you have libraries and schools and Main Street shopping centers, things that people would like to get to, and they might choose that mode if a more comfortable facility were available? Is it part of building your low-stress bicycle network, and could it improve connections for those disadvantaged populations for whom bicycling may be the best and only option they have for transportation? In terms of what width you might choose, this comes from the MassDOT guidance, where they recommend a range of widths depending on traffic volume. If you have a lot of bicyclists using the corridor, you're going to need some more passing opportunities and so forth. So you might choose a wider bike lane. If the traffic volumes aren't as high, then you can go narrower. And certainly for short distances, you can go down to 4 feet to accommodate the needs for bus stops or accessible parking spaces. If you have a two-way separated bike lane, you're certainly going to need some more width for the opposing directions of travel. And there again, because these separated bike lanes are constrained, you can't just ride in and out of them easily anywhere along the corridor. You need to think about those passing opportunities. Another question we received last week is, what do you do in terms of narrow corridors where you have to start thinking about compromises, and how do you make those decisions? And MassDOT came up with sort of a hierarchy or a flow of where you try to make the compromises if you have to. And the first was, look at the street. Do you need as much width for your travel lanes in the street, or can you borrow some space there? And then maybe tighten up your sidewalk buffer, not have as much space there. And then think about, well, can we steal some space from the street buffer? And then finally, or almost finally, the bike lane is where you can start making compromises there. And then last of all, the sidewalk, and start making compromises at that location. Peter, you had some thoughts about multiple minimums. I'd like to give you an opportunity to comment about that.
Sure. Quite often we have a range for a lot of different kinds of uses in the street. And if you pick the minimum of each one, we come up with the term multiple minimums. And then it can start not working for any of the modes. I'm just giving an example. So if you have a parking lane and you stripe it at 7 feet, not 8, and there's often 7 feet can work here, but the point here is the multiple minimum. So if you put in a 7-foot parking lane, and then you would say go to a 4-foot bike lane, and then you would go to a 10-foot outside travel lane, the combination of 3 minimums starts making it really tight for everyone, and it's probably something you just shouldn't go there. So that's what we mean by that. So there's always good judgment and choices that come into all of our design work.
Mike, do you want to add any thoughts to that?
Yeah, there's cases where we have an option. I remember when I first started out doing this, we put in a 4-foot shoulder because we didn't have enough room to put in a 5-foot bike lane, and we put an 11-foot traffic lane next to it, and we ended up, after we resurfaced, making it a 5-foot, giving the full width of the bike lane, and changing and marking it as a bike lane and taking a foot away from the travel lane. So there's an example as where we minimized the travel lane. There was multiple lanes in there and gave a little bit more comfort and room for the bicyclist. So there are some trade-offs there that can be done. But had it already been 10 foot, I wouldn't have made it 9 foot, because then we just wouldn't have done it. And sometimes it's maybe best to have just a wider shoulder, or if you can find another corridor to provide the bicycle facilities. A lot of the bike boulevards are done on collector-type streets, lower volume streets that have the connectivity through town, as opposed to putting everything out on the arterial street.
I would just like to echo that, is sometimes you have to make those tough decisions and decide that maybe this corridor isn't the best one for bikes. Where's an alternate route? And maybe thinking about a road diet on one of the crosstown corridors, reducing the number of motor vehicle lanes to provide for more bikes or pedestrians along that corridor, and then encouraging folks to use that corridor for that purpose. And maybe the other corridor has more of a motor vehicle emphasis. Not making every roadway for every use, or at least not for that low stress, comfortable network. Now, in terms of design choices for that separating element, we need to think both of the safety of the bicyclists and the motorists. Certainly, 1/3 of our roadside departure crashes happen in urban areas, or not crashes so much as fatalities. And so we want to be thoughtful about not creating something that's going to intrude into the passenger compartment of a motor vehicle should they happen to hit it and kill the motorist. We also need to think about maintenance, and certainly appearance is an issue. Flexible vertical posts can be a low-cost solution that has a lot of benefits to it, but perhaps in your neighborhood, people would resent having a bunch of reflective posts strung out in front of their front yard. So being strategic about where you place them, maybe at the conflict zones in particular, but maybe in the distance between, maybe fewer or a less obtrusive treatment would be appropriate. Peter, would you like to tell us about Seattle's approach to making some of these choices?
Yeah, and this is another good example where things are evolving very quickly, and there's a number of different ways that you can provide that separation, and you've Lucas have alluded to a couple of them. I would just say that the City of Seattle, because they're putting in so many of these kinds of facilities, are developing some guidelines for when it's appropriate to use different kinds of treatments for creating the separation, and some more detailed guidance on it. So at this point, it's still under development, but I think I would just point you to the City of Seattle and their website. I don't know when it's going to be done. Could be next fall, something like that. But just to note that I think new and more expanded guidance is coming.
Thank you, Peter. So we have a few examples just to show you of different treatments that have been used. This is in the city of Atlanta, where they have granite curb that is installed as a retrofit to create a separated bikeway. In Austin, they've used what they call turtles. In this case, they're concrete domes placed between the bikeway and the railway / travel lane. These are referred to as armadillos. They're a manufactured product that can be purchased. Then we have something like a rigid bollard, and this is one of those applications that I would shy away from just because we have something that could be at a risk to either the bicyclist or the motorist should they hit it, and it definitely seems to be very close to the travel lane for something that's solid. But it is an option if you have a wider buffer to use something that very emphatically defines the space between the bikeway and the motorway. We have an example from Vancouver here of planters, and it could be a very aesthetic feature, particularly if you have the time and resources to maintain that landscaping. But there again, depending on how it's designed and where the ends are, be cautious about the risk in terms of impacts. Then we also have raised medians between the bikeway and the travel vehicle lane. And finally, very definitive separation between the bikeway and the motorist would be a concrete barrier.
This is Pete. I'd just make one more comment here too. Is obviously some of these treatments will not work where you have a lot of snow, so that becomes a very big consideration. And then the other consideration, of course, is you have the right size sweepers to get in here if you provide those barriers and those separations. So just a lot of things to think through.
And that becomes a consideration as well when you're thinking about the width of your bikeway. Is your bikeway wide enough to provide for the maintenance tools that you have available? Or do you need to include a different type of maintenance vehicle in your maintenance fleet? Because these separated bikeways are arranged a little bit differently, we need to think about those conflict zones where you have motor vehicle parking, loading for the soda vendor who's delivering sodas to the vending machines in a building, bike parking locations, and bus stops. So this is an example from the FHWA guide on one approach that you might use, but I'd just like to highlight in particular, this is a location where you might narrow up your bikeway or curve it into the sidewalk if you have a wide amount of sidewalk frontage to accommodate the pull-off for the truck. We've also got a number of features to highlight that this is a point of conflict, that the bicyclist should expect someone to be crossing the bikeway and be more cautious and watchful of that, but also a location where the person unloading is more aware that they're crossing a travel lane for bicyclists. At transit stops, we want to think about a number of things like, can we move the bikeway to a street that has fewer transit stops, or the side of the street where there may be fewer transit stops? We want to provide guidance to the passengers. Certainly we want to have two crossings of the bikeway at the front and the rear of the loading zone, or the front or rear of the bus, because many buses have doors at both the front and back. And when you think about, I like to think about pedestrians as wildlife. They're going to take the shortest route to where they want to go, and if they're exiting at the front of a loading zone and they have to walk clear to the back to cross the street to then walk the opposite direction again, they're not going to do it. We want to make sure that we're providing the traffic control or design features that are communicating to bicyclists that this is a conflict zone, they need to be cautious and yielding to the pedestrians. And some of the designs that we have are referred to as floating bus stops, but we also have designs that work for in-lane operation of buses. This is an image related to the MassDOT guide where they have a floating bus stop. There's crossings both at the front and back. They provided some control to ensure that pedestrians are going to use the crossings where identified. And there's stop or yield markings as appropriate for the bicyclists to encourage those behaviors. This is one design that could be used in areas where you just don't have space for that floating island, where the bus can merge over the bikeway and pull to the sidewalk to unload and load passengers. And so it's been highlighted with some extra pavement messaging indicating that this is now a shared space as opposed to a dedicated bikeway. But there's some things to consider, like how long are buses going to be there? Do they have to pause and wait for 10 minutes to normalize their schedule? Are you going to have multiple buses? And how long are you expecting that bicyclist to pause behind the bus puffing exhaust at them? Or are you going to anticipate that the bicyclist will move over and take the lane? And what are the associated conflicts and risks related to that? So use this one cautiously and use it as appropriate with the bus volume and bike volume and roadway volume. So that's sort of sums up our conversation on separated bike lanes. Dan, do you have some questions? Or Pete or Mike, do you have some comments that you want to throw in before we move into railways?
If I could ask a question just on the slide you just presented, Brooke, the last couple, I guess. And I guess the question that came up was, why would you opt for something like this, or the situation where the bike lane goes behind the transit stop and the transit users have to cross the bike lane to get to the transit, as opposed to maybe putting that same bike lane just on the other side of the bus lane, so it's the bike lane is then between the bus lane and the travel lane. I guess in one scenario you are keeping the bikes from having to mix with the transit vehicles, like in this scenario, but then you're having the people who are accessing the transit stop have to cross that bike lane and worry about that. In the other situation, it seems like you are putting the bikes out into traffic a bit more, which may not be as comfortable, but you're also allowing that easier access for the pedestrians to and from the transit stop. It just seems like a trade-off, but I don't know if you have any further guidelines about when each of those scenarios is more appropriate.
I suppose my thoughts, this image that we're showing here, this would be nice for situations where you have frequent buses stopping. It gives a place for the pedestrians to unload and watch for that opportunity to cross the bike lane. Whereas in this scenario, if you had buses frequently pulling up to the stop, you're really interfering with the bicyclist travel. And in both cases, the bicyclist is having to yield, but I'd much rather be in a scenario where I'm yielding to pedestrians rather than dodging buses, if that makes sense. And there again, if you have buses pausing for a long extended period of time in the space, you're essentially destroying the connectivity of that bikeway network. Whereas the other location, the bicyclist is not in a conflict zone or at risk of being clipped by a bus. They're in a little more identified and separated space. Pete or Mike, do you have any thoughts that you'd like to add to that question?
This is Mike Sinecki, and I'm really concerned about when you're crossing bikes around the buses. The buses, even though they have a lot of mirrors, they can easy for a bicyclist caught in their blind zone or an area which is not covered by the mirror, or be so small compared to all the other things the bus driver is looking at. This is, I think, a safer condition, and again, coupled with the railing and the controlled crossing points, so that they're not crossing all over. It's going to be a lot easier for the bicyclist, a lot easier for the bus driver to have this type of situation.
This is Pete. I'd add one other thing, is that Looking at the image that you have right up there now, you notice that the bus stays in lane. In other words, it doesn't need to move out of lane and then wait for a gap in traffic to get back in lane. And so it allows the bus to stay on schedule, and also it's going to reduce the number of conflicts, buses with other general purpose traffic, because they're not leaving and entering that lane over and over and over again. So again, there's some real safety advantages here, but also just in terms of delivering the service, staying on time and on schedule with the bus, it really helps with that flow as well.
And I have seen another design used where in this scenario where the bikeway is actually raised to sidewalk level, and so the bus would stay in lane, and this would be a conflict zone between loading and unloading pedestrians and bicyclists. And even there, I think there's a risk, because if the bicyclist thinks, oh, they're done unloading, and one late passenger dashes into the bike lane, you've got a potential crash. But that is another design approach that I've seen to keep the bus in lane, but I think it might be making the risk for bike ped crashes worse.
Yeah, I really don't like that one, and especially if you have people in wheelchairs and people with visual impairment, it just doesn't work real well.
Yeah, and that brings a whole other question that we're getting is, that a lot of some of these treatments, and Pete, you can speak to this maybe from the MassDOT guide perspective, but there's there's issues in some of these areas where for individuals with disabilities and who need that tactile warning and to be able to understand what kind of space they're stepping into. There may be some. It seems like the questions we're getting, there's some lack of clarity out there about how to exactly you handle sort of the ADA compliance questions around some of these spaces.
Well, and I'm going to refer people to look at both the MassDOT guide and the FHWA guide. There's a number of treatments in particular for pedestrian parking, accessible pedestrian parking. But one of the arguments is if someone could park anywhere along the corridor and pull up to a sidewalk, they may be able to use whatever mechanism they have in their vehicle and unload or load there. Now we've restricted them to a few designated spaces that have the loading space and the detectable warnings to get them across the bikeway. But there's some concerns in general about separated bike lanes and the fact that you're perhaps reducing accessibility along the whole corridor in terms of parking. So I would suggest paying attention to, do you have some locations where you might have higher usage of accessible parking spaces and maybe provide some additional above and beyond what would be required? Or maybe there's some areas where maybe a separated bike lane isn't the best choice for that reason. But also with this design that we're showing here, certainly communicating to people who have visual impairments that this is a conflict zone, it would be difficult. And so it would probably be best to have the bus pulling up to the sidewalk if this is all the space you have available. But I think the other design shown here with the floating island is very desirable for many of the reasons that we've discussed.
And is there, getting back to the selection between this option and the other, are there thresholds on the number of buses that you would have turning over at different at these stations to maybe warrant this option over the other? Maybe if you have higher than some number of buses per hour or buses per day, is there guidelines or rule of thumb on that?
I'm not aware of any specific guidelines at the judgment call, unless Pete or Mike, you have a suggestion there.
No, I don't have one, but I would just add that it's not only the frequency of buses, but it's the frequency of the stops. And so, for example, if I've seen situations where there might be only one bus every 15 minutes, but when one does come, if they're stopping every other block, they're short blocks, and then you get this hopscotch kind of a effect where the bikes and the buses pass each other over and over and over again. So it's not just a one-time event, and that's really where you start seeing some of the benefits of this kind of design.
And in this, sorry to linger on this slide for so long, but there are several questions about it. what assumptions are made in this particular scenario about the speed that you're expecting bicyclists to be going? There's some concerns that anything over maybe, based on the comments, 10 or 12 miles an hour, that might be a fairly high-speed bicycle traffic area for people to just be crossing to and from those buses. Is that taken into account? Are there to be done? Someone suggested maybe a raised crosswalk here, for example. Are there things like that to be done in a situation like this to keep everything at a reasonable speed, or has that been discussed?
Well, I think that's. Go ahead.
I'll take it. That's
well, one thing is your casual rider is going to be in the 10 to 12 mile an hour range. Someone who really wants to ride their bike at 25 miles per hour is going to be a more aggressive rider, and they may be choosing to be in the street even though you have a separated bike lane. But certainly bicyclist speed, if you're on a downhill, you'd want to be thinking about slowing your bicyclists down in advance of this. And then Pete, what were you going to say?
Oh, I would look at, again, this is a really good example, this particular image. If you look at the marked crosswalk and you think of where the bike lane is as a roadway, and you think of the bicyclist as a vehicle, we know that there's three things that make for a safe crossing. And one is the number of lanes and the width, and this is very narrow. We also, when we're looking at motor vehicles, we also look at the speed, and in general, anything under 25 miles an hour is considered pretty slow when doing a pedestrian crossing of a roadway. And then we look at ADT, the average daily traffic. And, it's just not going to be that, no matter how many cyclists you have here, it's going to be probably lower than most crossings of roadways. So I think a lot of the same design principles that you would apply to pedestrians crossing a roadway, you can apply it to a bike lane here. I think the biggest challenge is going to be to direct the pedestrians to cross where you really want them to cross, and then to make both the pedestrians and the bicyclists aware of each other. And I do like the idea in some situations of having a raised crosswalk, just like you would have a raised crosswalk across a roadway, not all that dissimilar.
This is Mike, and I just wanted to make one other point. If you had a two-way cycle track along one side of the road, I don't see any other way of doing it than doing it something like this. Obviously, you're going to want to make some warnings for the pedestrians to look both ways crossing, but you're not going to bring a two-way cycle track across the bikeway and have the transit having to contend with bicyclists coming in two directions.
And then, so the another couple of issues come up with these, and they're not surprising ones. They come up a lot. One of them is maintenance, and you touched on that a bit. But I wonder if we can talk a bit more about maybe strategies to think about maintenance. You shouldn't, I guess if I'm phrasing it correctly, if I'm paraphrasing the comment, shouldn't let the maintenance concern get in the way of you creating a safe and comfortable facility for bicyclists. But can we point people to strategies or methods for effectively maintaining these facilities if they're typically using the standard street sweepers or plows, things like that? I mean, it's going to be much more difficult to get the standard equipment into and through some of these tighter facilities. Any tips or methods that you'd recommend for maintenance activities?
This is Mike here. I know when we looked at one facility, we basically, in one agency, we looked at the width of their maintenance vehicles and to make sure that we had it sized properly so that they could fit in. People can buy it, but they typically are not going to buy new equipment just for a new cycle track that comes in. So that may have to do some adjustments based on that. And that's just something that the designers should look into as a part of the process.
Well, and I was just looking at some information from the City of Montreal where they have been, in terms of snow removal, they've been looking at having an identified all-season network as compared to a just summertime network, making sure that they're communicating well to the public which facilities are part of which network, and they're striving to make sure all of their separated bikeways are part of their all-season network. And that includes things like, stacking the windrow in the buffer space between the travel lane and the motor vehicle lane, and the different types of snow removal they're using. They've been experimenting with sweepers, which if your snowfall isn't very deep, it tends to make a cleaner surface for bicyclists. They've also been experimenting with some sort of a grate type plow surface that leaves sort of grooved snow on the bikeway, but they don't have results yet on that to see if that would be better, where they leave a grooved snow surface with some grit on the top. One of the things that they did say was salt as a de-icing agent is less desirable for bicyclists.
And then just to get back to some other issues, Brooke, I don't know if you can make it back to, I'm trying to think of one of the examples you showed, where you've got maybe the bollards, one of the separated bike lanes with bollards or the flex posts. There are a lot of questions about, maybe even in this scenario, how you go about designing these facilities such that you're not going to just constantly get vehicle parking, unloading, loading vehicles kind of making their way into these lanes and out of them. I mean, that seems like a big, you could see, yeah, like in this scenario here, no one's maybe going to specifically jump over these bumps, but you could see a situation in which a large truck wouldn't have much trouble, and the loading, unloading could obviously hamper the ability of cyclists to even use this facility as it was intended. Any sort of just enforcement, I mean, are you thinking, is that when you're thinking about your width, when you come in and out of these, is that where you're designing them such that a car just couldn't quite fit?
Well,
I've had to deal with this a number of times, and I just start with the response is, I don't think it's always a real good idea just to say, okay, you can't be here. There has to be load and unload, and so you need to look at where there's a lot of demand for loading and unloading, and the options are, and then you have to provide for that space, and the options can be side streets, it can be alleys, it can be providing that space along with the bike facility. But that's one of those really important things you got to think through, because if you don't design for it, people are going to stop someplace and it'll be the wrong place, and it's going to be uncomfortable for somebody.
Okay. Yeah, certainly a big issue. I mean, I think parking in bike lanes is just a constant struggle. So hopefully we can figure out ways to go about that. It does seem like a balance of making sure there is space for it and making sure those lanes can stay clear. I know that I've derailed us a bit, but let's get. I know Mike has a few slides right at the end, I believe, that we still need to get to.
Well, and I'll just, while I'm moving over to those slides, I will mention that it sort of echoes the thought we had last time, is if you have a lot of non-compliance, ask yourself, have we done something with the infrastructure that's encouraging that non-compliance? As Pete said, making sure that there are opportunities for loading and unloading will prevent that non-compliance issue from happening. So moving into a discussion of railways, Mike, would you like to talk about your experience and observations with railways in the roadway and bicyclists?
Sure, and when we talk about railways, we're talking about mostly streetcars. A lot of communities have been building light rail and streetcars in recent years. And the main difference between the two of them, the streetcars is typically in a shared roadway space with other modes, motor vehicles and bicyclists. And if you look at the figure on the left, the typical flangeway, or that gap that is next to the rail, and is about 2.25 inches wide. For full-size railroads, heavy rail, it could be 2.5 inches wide, and sometimes up to 3 inches. But in addition to the flangeway being there, which is wider than most bicycle tires, the rail itself could be slippery and a chance to fall on. Many agencies have attempted to provide some warning for bicyclists. There is nothing in the manual. There is no signs. The sign on the right is a non-compliant sign. That is not a symbol sign that you can find in the manual. The manual requires, if you're going to use a symbol, that you have something that's unmistakably similar to a symbol that's currently been approved. I'd like to say that you can use any kind of a word sign that says rail and pavement, or embedded rails or something to that effect. Currently, there's an NCHRP pooled fund study that's looking into a desirable sign, a symbol sign that can be used to alert motorists of the flangeway and the rail in the street. And hopefully that may come out soon, or the results of the study may come out soon, and it may come out that they need to do some more looking. But that is something that's being looked into, and it is an important issue when you have a shared space between streetcars and bicycles in the street. And this shows a bicyclist actually turning left across this streetcar area, the rail line over there. When you get less than 60 degrees, that's when a chance for a thin tire can more likely drop into the track, or even just crossing it like that, you can slip on the rail itself. So those are issues when you get greater than 60 degrees. And in some cases, you can see a little bit of the green on the left. You can see where they attempted to use a bike cross to get the bicyclist to cross at 90 degrees. And the closer to 90 degrees is the better. But you'll have bicyclists doing all different things. And these look like they're seasoned bicyclists that have probably been across this route a number of times. So go into the next slide. And the big issue is, what do you do at transit stops? We talked a lot about bus stops and having with protected bike lanes. Well, if you have a bike lane next to an embedded rail line, you don't really want to encourage the bicyclist to be crossing those tracks at a shallow angle. So you do the similar types of thing as you bring the bicyclist behind the stop. And this is a pretty good example showing how not only behind the light rail stop, when you have the light rail station at the curb, but you're bringing it behind the waiting passengers. And you've got signs there that instructing bicyclists that they have to yield to the pedestrians on the sidewalk. The pedestrians have the right-of-way. And then you have another ramp on the other side that brings them in. And this uses the green striping to help guide the bicyclist beyond the rail line, so that they're not attempting to make the crossing the rails at the shallow angle. I think that's all.
I think yeah. Could you just go back one slide? And yeah, I just make one other comment too about the placement of the tracks within the street right of way. I'm seeing more often now where the tracks are placed, say, even to the left of a travel lane, and it can work not everywhere, but where you have people accessing the loading unloading area, say at a signalized crossing, so they can access it halfway across the street and do it that way, and that can really eliminate a lot of the sort of demand for the same piece of real estate between cyclists and the light rail. So there's more and more, I think, thought being given to that relationship and ways of designing around it.
Yeah, I've seen the designs, and we've looked at some designs for center running rail where the loading is in the median area. And the issues you have to be concerned about that is the left turns across the bicyclist left turns across it. Neither can be squared off, or they just need to make sure that there's a way to get across the rail at a closer to a 90-degree angle as opposed to a shallow angle.
Yeah.
Well, we have just a moment or two left. I don't know if we have time for Dan to slip in a few more questions in the end.
Well, and a question I'd like to ask is one that combines maybe 15 or 20 of the questions we got, and it's really a big one, and it maybe is something we can all offer our thoughts on. But we've covered a lot of different treatments, and I think we all kind of fairly well understand the parameters of each of these. Sharrow placement is important. We know what widths we need for shoulders. We know about rumble strips. We kind of know about bike lanes and then the parameters for separated bike lanes and things like that. But what we don't know and what people are struggling with is what thresholds, what inputs and criteria and characteristics do you use to move from one level to the next? When do you go from sharrow to bike lane? When are you going to go from a bike lane to a buffered bike lane, then to a separated bike lane? What are sort of the rules of thumb that are out there that you all maybe think about? So we heard a lot of discussion about speeds. volumes, things like that. But can you all maybe elaborate on how you would go about making those sort of tough decisions when we really do have a limited right-of-way in a lot of cases, and it's not sufficient, or it's not possible always to build out the full width with all the separated bike lanes and things we want. So how would you go about making some of these tough decisions?
I'll just start, and we haven't really talked about this internally as a team, so I welcome a different opinion on this. But in general, I look at shared lane markings as Plan B. In other words, usually if we can get a bike lane or some separation, I think that's generally preferred. And like we talked about earlier, there may be locations and spots or downhills where it's really the only option. So it's not a matter always of choosing between one. I think you start with higher level facility and you drop to the shared lane marking really as sort of a Plan B alternative when you don't have the space.
Well, and I would just also add, use the tools that we have available to help you see if you're getting what you need in terms of level of traffic stress for your overall network. Not every facility has to be all things to all people, but looking strategically at where you can get a low stress corridor that might provide that crosstown connection, and putting more emphasis on that if you're having to make compromises elsewhere.
Yeah, and this is Mike, and I believe that we're trying to get as many of those non-road warriors out in the streets. You're trying to make as much of a facility, of a separated facility, as a comfortable or a low-stress facility as possible. But as Peter said, that if you don't have the space, sometimes you would go to a Plan B or to an alternate route to get bicyclists through a corridor. So it's not, there's not anything in the cookbook but you have to try to get it as the best facility possible, the most comfortable facility possible, to get as many riders comfortable using it, and to see what you can get in. And sometimes that may mean taking out lanes. A lot of the road diets we've been doing have been being replaced by taking out a travel lane and putting in a bike lane on each side of the street.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there, unfortunately. We're right about over a minute over our time, but I want to thank you all very much for sharing so much information and responding to those questions as we went. I got to as many of those as we could, but I know that we left a lot of them unanswered. We hope that you'll continue and come back for our third part. We're really going to talk about what we do when all these facilities come to meet at intersections. Those are really going to be some of the tougher decisions we're going to have to make, is how to handle bicycle facilities at intersections, really create those safe mixing zones between vehicles, bicyclists, and pedestrians and all of our road users. So we hope you will join us on the 27th. Next Thursday, we'll continue the series. I want to remind you, everybody, that you're going to receive an email later today that'll have the link to the archive page for the webinar and instructions for downloading your certificate of attendance. A survey will appear after this webinar closes out. We'd appreciate your feedback on our performance today. And I just want to say thank you again to Brooke Struve, Mike Zanecki, and Peter Lagerway for today's presentation. And thanks to all of you for attending today's webinar. We'll see you back here on April 27th. Thanks very much.